The other day I saw a bumper sticker that read, "In Reason We Trust," which I took to be an obvious parody of the motto, "In God We Trust." My first thought was, oh really? While I consider myself a reasonable person, I'm not a great fan of reason. Oh, I know what you're thinking. What is wrong with you? Are you some sort of space cadet? I hope that I've piqued your interest, and if you would be so kind as to allow me to, I will explain. You see, I spent many years in oil and gas exploration. I spent massive amounts of time mining data and crunching numbers, hoping that by knowing the past, I could predict the future. I used an algorithm to evaluate drilling prospects, and by the time my career was over, I was considered to be an expert by some people, which I still find amusing. What do I know that you don't? Over the course of many years, I learned that no matter how sophisticated the math used to predict the success of a prospect, it guaranteed nothing. I could do the math a million times, use all the logic that I could muster, and still not be certain of anything. There is absolutely no keystroke on my computer that affected in any way what was actually there. The well simply had to be drilled to prove the validity of my theory. Why could I not be certain of anything? While I can predict with reasonable certainty some factors, there are still variables that are completely out of my control. Commodity prices, technical and logistical failures, etc. There may even be unknown factors at this time, which I'll call black swan, and therefore cannot be predicted at all. Watch out for those black swans, they will hurt you. There's absolutely no way that I could even understand all the variables that affect the prospect, much less control them. So, what I proposed to my prospective clients was not really science that had been proven, but actually art. I had taken known empirical data and subjectively interpreted it to draw the conclusion I wanted. Of course, my conclusion was that the prospect would be successful. I had all the charts and data to back my claim along with the latest, greatest projections. But there's a problem. What's the problem? The problem lies in the subjectivity used to interpret the data. Oftentimes, just like a person dying of thirst in the desert sees a mirage, as you crunch the numbers, you begin to see things in the data that simply aren't there. As a result of man's insatiable desire for success, we start seeing anomalies, correlations, and trends in the data that aren't there or are completely meaningless. Yet, we ascribe meaning to them and project our own subjective cause and effect into the data. The conclusion we then draw may be in fact beautiful, but completely wrong. Even worse yet, we tend to subconsciously dismiss negative data that does not help support our conclusion. Watch out for those cognitive biases. In dismissing negative data, you effectively cross over from art to make-believe. And isn't it fun to make believe? You don't even know it, but you're running a scam. Now you're qualified to sell drilling prospects. This has been aptly demonstrated by the number of people I've watched go broke in the oil and gas business. As Ezra Solomon, professor of economics at Stanford, quipped, the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. I think the Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich von Hayek summed it up best when he said, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine that they can design." So much for reason. But that's not the real problem I have with reason. No, it's the results of man's reasoning that I have a problem with. Reason brought us trickle-down economics and probably the greatest income and wealth inequality in history. Reason forces some kids to commit suicide and others to walk into a school with a gun and shoot their classmates. Reason brought us Charles Darwin and his Origin of the Species. There is no God. We descended from monkeys, and life really boils down to survival of the fittest, as it's been called. The end justifies the means. Reason brought forth the likes of Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and a Supreme Court that ruled in favor of abortion. What is the result of man's reasoning in this world? Hundreds of millions of dead bodies and countless other lives devastated by their loss. No thanks. I much prefer divine revelation. I much prefer thou shalt not kill, and love God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And I am not the only person who thinks this way. Immanuel Kant, the greatest modern philosopher and one of the greatest minds in history, wrote a book entitled The Critique of Pure Reason, in which he set limits to reason, stating that reason is limited to experience, or in other words, knowledge is limited to proof. Kant recognized that in the history of philosophy there had been endless debate as to whether the world is infinite or finite, whether it's had a beginning in time or whether it always existed, and other such questions. He was hoping that by explaining the limits of human knowledge, he could put an end to the constant debating about metaphysical questions, which are beyond the limits of our ability to know. Having explained what we can know and how human knowledge is possible, Kant recognized that there are still beliefs worth having as human beings, despite those beliefs not being based in absolute certainty. In his critique of practical reason, Kant explains that certain beliefs, such as belief in God or the afterlife, can be a good thing since they give people the strength to persevere in the face of adversity. In effect, Kant set limits to reason and made room for faith. How did he do this? Given that the knowledge of God is beyond what reason is capable of knowing, and the existence of God can't be proved or disproved, it is reasonable to hold the belief that has better results. Clearly, anyone can see that by following divine revelation, this world would be a better place. This was, after all, demonstrated by helping make America the greatest nation on earth. So, the fact is, it is more reasonable to believe in God we trust than in reason we trust. Oh, I know what you're thinking. You've crossed over from art to make-believe. Who could possibly believe in God when there is no proof at all for his existence? Faith in God is just fairy tales and wishful thinking. Oh, really? My belief in a spiritual dimension that can't be measured using current science but only understood is just make-believe? Well, what then do you think about the latest in theoretical physics, M-theory, as promoted by the late physicist Stephen Hawking? One striking feature is that string theory requires the existence of 10 space-time dimensions. Currently, we only know of 4: depth, height, width, and time. We could somehow be forced to live in a 4-dimensional world without access to the extra dimensions. Stephen Hawking had pinned his hopes on M-theory, which lives in 11 space-time dimensions. The Bible tells us that Jesus Christ is God incarnate, the revelation of God to the world. This extraordinary claim means that if you don't accept him for who he is, then you are blind and walking in darkness. You have no way of understanding God and his way because, as the empiricist David Hume realized, you can never have true knowledge of reality since you are trapped inside your own mind. I thank God that I'm no longer trapped inside the black hole of my own ego. Jesus is the greatest person to have walked the face of this earth, which is a very material fact. And this fact empowers me to live a happy, meaningful life, the goal of all human wisdom, in spite of the reality that life is often difficult and even tragic. Now the real question is, who is the space cadet? I guess only time will tell.